The Temple of Atal Hakar, or more commonly, the Sunken Temple, home to the Atalai cult of jungle trolls in the centre of their worship of the Bloodlower, Hakar the Soulflayer. I'm Shuppzy, and today in Warcraft Space and Story, we're going to look at something a little different. We're going to see how the story and lore of a space can remain mostly consistent, even after it goes through a massive overhaul in terms of game design. Once a sprawling labyrinth of different levels and twisting hallways made for players in the early level 50s, the temple is now a simple disc with a few short wings splitting off from the main chamber. This dungeon gives us a really good case study for the pros and cons of changes to the gameplay experience on this kind of scale. That's because, unlike most of the other dungeons in this series thus far, the Sunken Temple tends to get forgotten a lot and doesn't seem to have as much nostalgia associated with it, so it's easier to be a bit more objective. Now, just looking at this, it seems weird for the trolls to build a massive temple in the middle of a lake, right? Well, that lake that we see around the temple is actually a crater, caused by the green dragon aspect Ysera, when she tore the place apart and sunk it into the earth in order to try and stop the Atalai summoning Hakar into the world. The main temple building was the only thing to survive in any decent state from the ruins we see dotted around. The pre-dungeon of the Sunken Temple is a very strong reminder of how the space used to be laid out. Long, narrow, angular paths usually leading downwards through fairly repetitive green hallways. Now, something of interest is this piece of artwork. It repeats often throughout the dungeon, and honestly I don't really know what to make of it. The large face in the bottom middle seems to be a goblin with a large earlobe and lack of tusks, while the figure in the bottom left looks like half of an orc's face, specifically looking a lot like Garrosh. One of the more out there but entertaining theories I've heard is that the four faces on the right are the Council of Elders from Throne of Thunder. But I just can't buy the idea that Blizzard was so enamored with that boss fight that they had to make artwork hinting to it more than a decade before it actually happened. Right before the portal we get this hint of the enemies to come, with these two corrupted guardian dragon spawn here. So not only did Ysera tear most of the place apart, but she also sent quite a large contingent of her own dragons and even one of her consorts to watch over the place and make sure nothing foul happens here again. As we can guess from the corrupted in their name, it didn't exactly work out. So I've made a lot of fuss about how much this place was cut down, so to give some context to that, this is a breakdown of the original dungeon with all its different levels, what paths led where, and so on. And this is the part of the dungeon that remains. The main chamber that we see here is what's called the Pit of Sacrifice. There's quite a few interesting things to notice about this space. The first and most obvious is the massive beam of sunlight shining into the middle of the room. Originally, players would spend a lot of time winding around this room, going to each of the terraces we see located around the pit and taking out the Atalai priests. Just like we saw way back in Moradon, Blizzard is using people's natural urge to go towards sunlight as a sort of goal for them to be able to work their way through the priests and to finally get here. Now, if you had wanted to stand directly under the sun, then you'd be in trouble, because there was originally no grate here, just a lethal drop into the pool of refuse. These two spaces and how they're linked also shows a sort of cruel pragmatism from the Hakari trolls. The Pit of Sacrifice would have effectively been the commons of the temple, so once you drained your poor victim of all that useful god-empowering blood, you dragged them over here and threw them into basically the bin, because even insane cultists know you shouldn't litter. The first wing we're going to go to is on our left, and worth noticing as we pass through is how light and even lax the green dragon presence is here compared to the rest of the dungeon. This path leads to the lair of the Chosen, the holdout of the Atalai trolls. The lore kind of supports two views as to why there's so few green dragons around here. The first is that the Atalai have been carefully hunting them down and using their more magically attuned blood to accelerate Hakar's summoning. And the other is that despite this originally being a troll temple, the powers that are now in conflict here, dragons, lower and worse, have pushed them back into this little out-of-the-way chamber. Blizzard seems fond of laying out rooms in dungeons and raids this way, a sort of school layout as it were, where the boss is on a raised platform at the end, clearly marking them out and giving players a goal, but there's a large number of often quite challenging enemies between the start of the room and the boss, meaning you have to use the length of the space to pull and kite mobs away from each other. A few examples of how this has been used over the years are the Scarlet Monastery Cathedral, Lady Deathwisper's room in Icecrown Citadel, and High Priestess Azil from Stonecore in Cataclysm. The boss we find at the end of the room, furiously casting away at something, is Jamalan the Prophet, current leader of the Atalai, and the one who received a vision from Hakar, ordering dragon blood be used to fuel him and to reignite the worship of the Bloodlower among the Jungle Troll tribes. So in a way, despite being a not well remembered boss in a not well remembered dungeon, Jamalan is pretty much the catalyst for a lot of the troll lore that has happened thus far in WoW. Returning from Jamalan into the Pit of Sacrifice causes two corrupted green drakes, Dreamscythe and Weaver, to swoop down and begin patrolling around the pit. So these two are the guard captains, if you'd like, of the green dragon forces watching the Sunken Temple, and as drakes they are by far the most powerful dragonkin we've seen thus far in the dungeon. What they do in terms of the space though is very important. Forcing players to backtrack without any sort of payoff is one of the big no-nos in terms of spatial game design. Without these two here, we would end up walking a long way through stuff we've already seen before. The entrance to the next wing, the Sanctum of the Fallen God, does have a group of dragon spawn at its entrance, and they're facing inwards, which says that they're more concerned about whatever is inside than the group of adventurers tearing their way through dozens of their kin. Beyond them are a few Hakari wind serpents which provide a pretty clear hint of what we should expect, especially considering the name of this wing. In the Sanctum proper, we see a ritual circle with a massive wind serpent skeleton inside it, and an ominously glowing pile of skulls next to the circle. This is where we get to one of those situations that could only ever happen in vanilla, because to interact with the skulls you need an egg or scroll obtained as part of the quest chain that begins in Tanaris, that takes you to the Hinterlands, then here, before continuing on to Blackrock Mountain, and finally Stranglethorn Vale. Assuming someone in our group had the time and patience for world-hopping adventures, we'd then begin an event to douse the flames around the room before finally summoning the avatar of Hakar. So Hakar is a lower, and thus a wild god, presumably the wind serpent wild god, but what makes him interesting is how much further he's gone beyond that role. A lot of the hints in vanilla seem to point at Hakar as the source of the nightmare, but that's mostly been shifted away from to being an old god thing. We can still say that Hakar is a nightmare corrupted wild god, but what I was referring to earlier is that unlike other corrupted demigods, he seems to have completely moved away from his animalistic role, and instead seems to relish civilization, as long as it's worshipping him. Of course, this is just an avatar, formed from the echoes of his power the player was tricked into gathering in the aforementioned egg. His much more impressive and iconic blue-feathered, scythe-armed, fancy red jacket-wearing form was still unknown by players at the time. The last thing of interest in the Sanctum is that unlike any other space in the dungeon, it has two entrances and thus two potential exits. Lore-wise, we can say that that's because it was the most important room in the temple, and needed the ability for massive quantities of blood to be moved in and out of here, but it also is another example of avoiding backtracking that we were talking about earlier. New players coming through here at Vanilla wouldn't have had the resources like WoWWiki/Wowpedia, Wowhead, or even Thoughtbot, so it's likely at least a few of them would have made their way here without any means of summoning the avatar, be forced to turn around and leave. It's by no means equivalent to a boss fight, but having this alternate exit still with a few mobs in it means the flow of the dungeon is somewhat maintained, rather than it breaking down completely as players leave empty-handed. The final wing of the dungeon is again protected by a group of dragon spawn, this time facing outwards to keep us, the players, out. Behind them we see a large group of whelps and even faintly make out another set of drakes. So subconsciously we get the sense that this is the payoff to the dragon side of the Sunken Temple story. And really I think that points to one of the greatest strengths of this dungeon, which is arguably more evident in its trimmed version, in that it juggles and balances two very strong fantasy tropes and melds them together through lore, space, and even enemy layout as we've seen. The first theme is that of the evil cultist temple, full of dark rituals and atrocities committed in the name of a malevolent god. And the second is that of the Dragon's Lair, a place full of rare treasures and knowledge, protected by creatures only the mightiest of heroes would dare face. And speaking of dragons in fantasy, there's hardly a more iconic image that comes to mind than the great worm asleep in the depths of his lair, not caring a smidge about the upstart heroes in his home. But of course, in this case, the story context plays with the elements of that trope a little bit. Rather than sleeping peacefully on mountains of gold and jewels, the Shade of Oranicus is trapped in between nightmare and reality in an empty room. Either way, for many players, this would have been their first experience with a full-grown dragon in Warcraft, and certainly one of the first chances to become a dragon slayer. Oranicus was once the consort of Ysera. When she needed someone to guard the temple she'd mostly just ruined, he was the first pick. Unfortunately, what couldn't be predicted was the Emerald Nightmare taking hold here, and leaving confused and corrupted members of her brood to be hunted down and used as fuel for what they were sent here to stop. I usually like to wrap up by going through what we the heroes have done here, but in this case I almost think it might be worth going through what Blizzard has done here. It really seems like the mission statement for the Temple of Atal Hakar was to lay groundwork for further developments. Everything about the dungeon is a hint to something else. Shades, avatars, secret cults, visions, dreams, nightmares. Some of these hints developed quickly, and others we're still unraveling. To address the point I made in the intro of using this space as a case study, and I guess I'm going to speak personally here, I'm usually very heavily pro original design and big grand experiences, but I think this is a case where as much, if not more, is done with less. I've been Shuppzy, and that was the story of the space and how the space has told the story. A little bit of a different take on this one, talking about the old and new designs in comparison and contrast. I figured for some of the remaining vanilla dungeons it's going to be impossible to avoid the new versions, so this was one of the ways I was thinking of addressing that. So I hope you still liked this video. If you did, it would be great if you liked this video. Otherwise, I love to hear from you guys in the comments, and if you want to subscribe, I absolutely plan on developing this series and a few other hopefully cool ideas for the channel in future. Thank you for your time.